Hey designers, I have a really quick tutorial for you today about making a tool. There's something really wonderful about sort of realizing that you don't have the tool you need and looking around and making it with some of the basic supplies that I provided. So all semester long so far we've been doing our folding projects, and you've been seeing me either use my fingers to sort of crease these folds, or using the sort of popsicle stick. It's able to do reasonably good job of laying down these creases, but eventually you guys will be working on folds that are detailed enough that you just can't get the big blunt point of your popsicle stick, and especially not the big blunt edge of your finger, to make some of these small creases. And so you've seen me use the bone folder. Bone folders are really handy. The material that they're made out of is very dense, and so when they grind and polish the tip, what you get is a real smooth, hard surface for bending and creasing. Since they're about $8 a piece, you could just go out and buy one. I would suggest not trying to find any budget versions. The budget versions are made out of composite plastics, and they just don't hold up very well, and oftentimes have weird casting marks. I suggest grabbing your popsicle stick and actually shaping the tip into the right shape, the sort of pointed shape that you need, and then using successive grits of sandpaper to lay down a really nice polish. And honestly, it'll be as nice, or probably better, than the bone folders that you can buy for about $8. And on top of that, you made it. So let's actually go through those steps to figure out what you're going to have to do to make it function. Dig out of your kit those 2 pieces of sandpaper I've given you, because we got to talk just briefly about the numbers on the back and what they mean. I'm also going to show you the 4-inch belt sander that I've got here in my studio, because it's almost identical to the belt sander we use at school. It's a little bit overkill for this project to be working something so small, but to rough in the basic shape of your tool, I would suggest putting it to work on the belt sander. Just grind it off, and then we'll actually use some hand sanding to sort of finish the tip. Before we actually get into the shaping though, a quick word about these numbers on the back of your sandpaper. The lower number that we've got on our sandpaper is the 120 sandpaper, 120 grit sandpaper. I want you to feel that with your thumb, get a sense for how abrasive that will be and how aggressive of a cut it will have. The other sandpaper that we're using is a 220 grit sandpaper. You should be able to feel a pretty significant difference in the amount of cut or the amount of abrasion. The grains or the grit that make this sandpaper sandy are larger and further apart, and the grains and the grit that make this 220 sandpaper gritty are smaller and closer together. And I'll actually introduce some other sandpapers to you guys in order to kind of step up the polish and the sanding. So we'll go from 220, and if we're going to follow our grits, I would actually suggest going for like a 320, maybe a 400, and then I also have some emery paper, which is closer to 1,000 or maybe even 1,500 grit sandpaper, which will put a sort of a shine just like the bone folders, and that way it won't damage or rip the paper. Now, as we're sanding this thing, I want you to kind of get in the habit of just using your fingers to sort of feel for hard edges or sharp edges. It should feel butter smooth. That way, when you're laying it in to do your creases, you won't damage the surface finish of the paper. So the belt sander at school functions just like this one here. What makes it a belt sander is that these sandpaper belts that are sort of wrapped around the machinery travel around a couple of rollers and create this sort of continuous abrasion. We can buy replacement sandpapers for our belt sander. This one is going to run at about a worn out 80 grit. We'll probably use something along those lines to do what's called a rough-in on your popsicle stick. And rough-ins really are just designed to cut away some of the material to shape it into that sort of teardrop shape. The way that I'll run this on the sander is I'll just kind of walk the popsicle stick across the top of the sander, keeping my fingers away from this kind of barrel on this end. And as I kind of roll the popsicle stick, it'll remove some of that extra material, and then I'll kind of scoop the edges a little bit, and those sort of scooping motions will round off any of those rough edges. But let's say you don't have access to the 4-inch belt sander, and you're stuck at home and you just got the sandpapers that I've given you. Well, you're not totally out of luck. Use the flat surface of a table and you're starting with your 120 grit sandpaper to begin sort of working down that edge. And 120 grit is aggressive enough that if you stay at it and you make about 100 strokes, you'll easily be able to cut away that wood. Even faster, though, is if you're careful enough using your X-Acto blade, you can sort of whittle down the edges. I highly recommend grabbing a pencil and just sort of marking off roughly where you want your shapes to be. Because you're trying to sort of make small shavings with the X-Acto blade, you want to make sure that you're kind of getting close to the blade, close to that mark, and not going over. That technique of just kind of roughing off the big areas will save you a whole lot of strokes on the sandpaper, so that when you get down to it, in probably the same amount of time, maybe add a little bit extra if you've never carved anything before, you'll be able to sort of build that tip on the 120 paper. Now, the 120 paper and the X-Acto blade are for roughing. The 220 paper will be for sanding a more of a finished feel to that wood. And as you are sanding and working it down, use your fingers to sort of tell you the truth about how much more work you have to do. I'm rotating the popsicle stick as I turn, and that will help eliminate any coarse edges around the outside. And once I sort of feel like I'm in a good spot there, I'll step up to my polishing papers. Now, you don't have any of the polishing papers in your kit, and you also don't have a sort of soft foam sanding block at home. These are materials that I can make available for you at school, but what the soft sanding block allows you to do is pillow off any of the kind of sharp edges that might still be left. Especially the point. You don't really want to sort of design yourself a wooden blade. You sort of want a bit of a blunted tip. And because this sandpaper will end up kind of curving around the edges because it's foam block instead of the hard surface of the table, it does a really nice job of sort of smoothing off any of those edges. Doing this work by hand gives me much more control over what's going on up here at the tip. Making one stroke, maybe a second or 2 strokes a second, is significantly more controlled than the big belt sander. Once you've got the sort of tip built into the right shape and you've got all the rough edges pillowed off, we have to switch toward polishing. And so I'll make some of those extra sandpapers available for you at school, but this already using the 120 grit sandpaper, and it's pretty good. I bet I could use that tool to fold paper, but by putting a polish on it, I know that I won't damage the surface of the paper for really complicated folds. By the time you get to 400 and 1000 grit sandpaper, these sandpapers barely feel like there's any abrasive on them at all. In fact, this almost feels smoother than a sheet of paper. And what you'll find is as you step up your polishing papers, the feeling is no longer a feeling of sort of cutting grains, but what's going to be sort of a polishing action on the outside of the wood. And the more strokes you make with these, the more polished it gets. So after a few minutes of polishing, I've worked my way up the grits from 120 to 220 to 320, 400, and then maybe a 500, 600, 700 grit emery cloth. I've put basically the same kind of polished finish on this piece of maple hardwood, and I'm able to use this stick right away instead of ordering on Amazon and waiting a few days. Getting in the habit of making and designing and modifying tools is a really handy kind of tip for all kinds of work in the art studio, and throughout the semester I encourage you guys to kind of continue to innovate and think about how you might design or even redesign a tool that's already in your kit. I'll see you in the studio, guys.